Welcome back to this lecture series on how to write analytically about film. If you've been paying attention to the previous lectures, you will know that we have already laid down 500 words of our paper by writing a 1-paragraph introduction, as well as a 2 to 3 paragraph summation of our research. That leaves us with about 1,200 words, and we will save 100 of those words for our conclusion. So in truth, when it comes to body paragraphs that analyze the film clip you've selected in your film, you only have about 1,100 words, and that breaks down to about 4 or 5 body paragraphs. This lecture's intention is to look at how those body paragraphs are structured. We will be using language from our previous lectures, specifically language of film that is used to describe what we see, as well as language from our research, which we might make passing references to. Both of those sources, the research and your language of film, are meant to build logos, our logical case, in order to prove to the reader that your thesis is probably correct. Okay, before we go any further into the paragraph, I want to talk briefly about the 5-minute clip you've selected. In my case, I've selected a clip that specifically evokes my thesis, how technological and environmental changes lead to suffering. So just make sure when you pick your clip that you have one that really shines a light on your thesis. Next, you have to examine the whole clip at the same time. You can't focus on every single frame of the clip, okay? Meaning you're going to have to go into some great detail on certain moments of the clip, but you have to choose those moments carefully so that you are addressing the whole of the sequence. That's really important. Finally, a friend of mine once told me about analysis. If your film clip features a decapitated head in the middle of the road, for example, and your analysis fails to mention this part of the scene, you've kind of failed in your analysis. So my last piece of advice when you're selecting what to talk about when you look at that clip is be mindful of moments in your clip where it feels like the director was being really purposeful, like making a really bold, unique choice in the action or the blocking or the editing or the color choice, something like that. Anything that really just pops out in that scene, because whoever grades you is going to be looking at the same clip before they read your paper, and they're probably going to see the same head in the road, and they're going to be looking for you to address the obvious. Okay, for my body paragraphs, I'm going to select 4 moments in my clip. Here's a look at my pre-writing where I broke out all the moments that I thought I could write about. I actually identified 6 really important movements in my clip, but remember, I don't have time for 6 probably. I can only really write about 4, maybe 5. So I don't go over my word limit. I've purposefully selected moments that take me through the whole of the clip. If you notice the 4 that I selected from the 6 that I pre-wrote about. You'll also notice here that next to each moment, I included at least one film technique. If you're a new writer to this style, I strongly encourage you to do this. Most new writers simply summarize what happened, but your job is to analyze. So it's a good idea to put down the techniques in your pre-writing that you plan to write about. So it forces you to remember that it's your job to explain how you see that technique at work in the clip. And then explain how that technique connects back to your thesis statement in some way. Okay, so let's take a look at one of my moments. The scene at the end of the clip where the tractor drives away. I'd like to make a musical analogy for this next part. You see, I play the ukulele. When I strum one hand movement down, it makes the sound of a chord. But when you look at the chord, you see it's actually the combination of a bunch of strings being plucked at the same time. If you were to teach someone how to create this chord, you would have to not just play the chord itself so that they could hear it, but you would also have to explain your finger positioning for each of the strings that makes the sound that way. And that is exactly how analysis works. Your job is to explain the overall impact of the scene, but it's also your job to focus on how very specific elements within that scene combine to bring about that effect. Therefore, you should do some pre-writing for each of your body paragraphs that looks at, let's say, 3 or 4 specific elements. Your job is to describe those elements and then to describe how they all combine to create the larger emotional impact of that moment. So take a moment and see how I broke down that particular sequence. Okay, now we're ready to write. There are lots of methods to describe how to write a body paragraph. I like the acronym OEA. It stands for Observation, Evidence, and Analysis. So observation is more than just summarizing. An observation is you, the writer, making a claim that needs to be proved. The evidence, therefore, is more like a summation of what you saw, describing specific actions and dialogue from the scene, but only to illustrate how your observation is correct. Your analysis, therefore, is to explain to the reader what you saw happening in that evidence. When you explain, you will use the language of film technique, as well as use your knowledge of what we all generally agree techniques do emotionally for a scene. OEA. Let's take a look at 4 moments in the film clip, but I'm going to convert them into observations. As you read over these observations, I want you to notice 2 things. First, the observations are things I, the analyzer, am seeing, okay? And conclusions that I am drawing. Conclusions that for sure will require evidence and analysis to prove to the reader are probably correct. Next, I want you to notice that I embedded one unique film technique in each of those observations. I talk about how the director uses a technique to do something specific. This is a very specific choice in my writing, and new writers to analysis often forget to analyze technique. So I am suggesting to you that you can and should be very direct in your observations. Force yourself to mention technique so that you are then forced to discuss in your analysis that technique and how it works within your evidence to help prove your ideas. Finally, I want you to notice how the observations are more about the thesis and less about the specific evidence. This is also really important. You always want to be directing your reader back to the main thrust of your essay. The observation is a great way to do that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the acronym for this is OEA, but you might find a better acronym after seeing this breakdown is OEA, EA, EA. And that's because we are going to use our musical analogy now, that instead of talking just about one piece of evidence after the observation, we will try to discuss 3, and you will force yourself to analyze after each piece, or if I could use that musical analogy, string. This is another opportunity to do some pre-writing, especially if you aren't used to this style of writing. Here's a sample pre-writing outline of the first observation. As you read over my pre-writing, you'll notice that even though flashback is the technique I mentioned in my main observation, I'm also mentioning other techniques along the way. It's just that flashback is what I would call my dominant technique. Or, I guess to use another turn of phrase, it's the head in the middle of the road, okay? The flashback is the thing that the reader will likely see, and it's the thing you really got to talk about when you talk about it. Okay, let's look at this in paragraph form. In the scene chosen for this textual analysis, Ford uses flashback to show the death of the sharecropping system. As the sequence opens, we see Tom and the preacher have taken refuge in an abandoned house. But it isn't abandoned. Muley is discovered in the house, also hiding from the police. Figure 1. It is interesting how Ford uses light and sound to create the mood for the scene. The lighting is harsh and uses heavy shadows. The sound editing of the wind is also heavy. The scene feels more like a horror movie. It is meant to create a fearful mood. Muley even refers to himself as a, quote, graveyard ghost, quote, in the flashback scene, which strengthens this horror film motif. Additionally, the viewer sees Muley from a high angle looking down, see figure 2. Ford's specific choice of the high angle is meant to give Muley a sense of powerlessness. Given the situation, Ford likely meant for the viewer to infer that the power Muley lost was the power that comes from having a safe place to live. Finally, as Ford transitions into the flashback, Muley says, quote, "I'll tell you how it happened to me anyway." Ford uses Muley's dialogue in a suggestive way. He is suggesting that Muley's experience is like what everyone else has experienced. Therefore, Muley is created by Ford to act as a horrific symbol that represents the whole of the sharecropping experience in America during this time. Figure 1. A single candle creates chiaroscuro lighting on Tom and Jim as they explore an abandoned house. Figure 2. Muley's powerlessness in society is conveyed through a high-angle shot in the abandoned house. Let's break down the paragraph. I have an observation. That's followed by evidence. You can really see my evidence if you look at the transitional language I use for each. As the sequence opens, additionally, and finally. You will also notice that the evidence that isn't dialogue is given a reference, figure 1 and figure 2. That's because I'm going to actually add screenshots into the paper to show the reader what I'm talking about. So in other words, you can say that my evidence, all three pieces, end with the citation, okay? You'll also notice that my evidence is usually just about a sentence each time. When I switch to analysis, you'll notice I stop describing what's happening in the film and I start making logical connections as to why Ford likely did it in that way. I take the time to actually explain how symbolism works, how one thing represents another thing. I also take time to show how a high-angle shot works to create powerlessness. If you're watching for word count, this body paragraph is about 250 words, which means 4 paragraphs should come to about 1,000 words, which puts me in a really good space because that would leave me with about 200 words for my closing. It's okay to be a little under your 1,700 word limit, but you can't be over your 1,700 word limit. So let's look at one more body paragraph for this paper so you can see the pattern one more time. OEA, EA, EA. As the flashback finishes, Ford uses symbolism to lament the inhumane way in which America handled change. The sequence opens with a mid-shot of the tractor as it drives through the family on the way to the house, figure 7. Ford films the tractor from the back, in part to hide the human driver, suggesting that Muley is dealing with a machine more than a man at this point. Additionally, Ford blocks this scene so that the tractor divides the family in two as a way to symbolize the human cost of ending sharecropping, the breakup of families. Additionally, the scene cuts away from the tractor as it destroys the home to instead focus specifically on Muley in a shot tight enough to show him and his shotgun together, figure 8. Ford uses a tighter shot here to focus in on Muley's emotional journey. Muley lowers his last weapon when his ability to reason has run out. This moment juxtaposes nicely with the opening of the sequence. Muley loses hope because you cannot kill a machine. Finally, the camera shows the tractor, again from the back, riding off into the distance. Then the camera pans back along the tractor tracks and comes to a rest on the shadows of the families. Ford's use of the wide shot is powerful here because it suggests that the tractor is off to destroy more homes in this setting. As Muley intimated earlier, his story was everyone's story. More powerful than that, Ford uses symbolism at the end. By focusing on the family's shadows, it is meant to show their symbolic death. The fact that the shadows stretch across the tractor tracks is done very purposefully to blame technology for this symbolic death. Okay, do you see my observation? It should be the first sentence we read in the paragraph. Can you find my 3 pieces of evidence? Each should be about a sentence long, and they should end with a citation. Can you find my 3 pieces of analysis? Each should follow the citation and focus its language on what the director did, no longer talking about a summation of the scene. All right, thanks for coming along on this journey in this lecture. I hope it has shown you an easy way to write powerful body paragraphs. We will close this lecture series out next time with a look at conclusions. Thanks.